All right, let's dive into what is, without a doubt, the single most destructive event in all of human history, the Second World War. We're going to unpack how it all started, hit the crucial turning points, and really see how its legacy is still shaping the world we live in right now. To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this thing, let's just start with one number: 75 million. That's the best estimate we have for the number of people, soldiers and civilians alike, who died in just 6 years. It's just staggering. An entire generation completely devastated. And that really brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did the world get to a point where a conflict this huge, this deadly could even happen? Well, to figure that out, we actually have to go back to the end of the First World War. You know, there's this old saying that the end of one war holds the seeds for the next. And boy, was that true here. The so-called peace that ended World War I basically created the perfect storm for an even bigger, even deadlier war to kick off just 20 years later. And it all really begins right here, with the Treaty of Versailles. This was the document signed back in 1919 that was supposed to create a lasting peace. But for Germany, it was basically a punishment. It forced the entire country to take the blame for the war and pay a crippling amount of money to the winners. So look at the difference here between what was intended and what actually happened. The demands were harsh, yeah, blame, money, lost land. But the reality on the ground in Germany, it was total economic ruin, a deep sense of national humiliation, and just widespread simmering anger. This wasn't just about money. It was a wound to their national pride. And, this kind of environment, all that anger and desperation, it was the perfect breeding ground for extreme ideas. And along comes this guy, Adolf Hitler, and his Nazi party, and he just taps right into that public reach. He's promising to tear up that treaty, rebuild the country, and make Germany strong again. So after years of testing the waters and breaking promises, this was it. This was the final straw. September 1st, 1939, German troops storm across the border into Poland. And that's when Britain and France said, enough, declared war, and the Second World War officially began. And what started as a fight in Europe, well, it didn't stay in Europe for long. It quickly spiraled out of control, pulling in countries from literally every corner of the globe and creating two massive opposing sides. So on one side, you had the Axis powers. This was mainly Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, all driven by this idea of aggressive military expansion. And fighting against them were the Allied powers, a huge, sometimes pretty shaky coalition that eventually included Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, China, and, of course, the United States. But this war wasn't just fought on battlefields. At the very dark heart of Nazi ideology was a horrifying plan for systematic murder. We're talking about the Holocaust, where they murdered 6 million Jewish people, men, women, and children. It was genocide on an industrial scale. And the absolute horror of it didn't stop there. It's so important to remember that the Nazis also targeted and murdered millions of others they considered undesirable. We're talking about Romani people, disabled people, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war. The list goes on. It's just one of the darkest chapters in all of human history. Now, for the first few years of the war, honestly, the Axis powers looked unstoppable. They were just rolling over everyone. But then, in 1941, two massive things happened that completely changed the game and started to turn the tide. Okay, first up, Hitler makes a gigantic strategic mistake. He tears up his non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and launches this massive invasion. This opens up the Eastern Front, which was just brutal, and it stretched Germany's army and resources to the absolute breaking point. And then, on the complete other side of the world, Japan launches a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, and that one act brings the full industrial power of the United States into the war on the side of the Allies. Now, the conflict was truly global. There was no turning back. So now you've got the incredible industrial might of the U.S., and this vast, bleeding front in the Soviet Union. The tide really starts to turn. The Allies, now at full strength, begin to launch this huge, coordinated pushback all across the globe. And you start to see these key victories that just chip away at the Axis war machine. On the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad becomes this incredibly brutal meat grinder that stops the German advance cold. Out in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway is a massive naval victory that cripples the Japanese fleet. And then, of course, there's the D-Day invasion in Normandy, opening up the final front in Europe. It was the beginning of the end. And you can really see here how fast things moved at the end. After D-Day in 44, the Allies were closing in from all sides. By May of 45, Germany surrenders. Just a few months later, the US uses atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which leads to Japan's surrender in September. And just like that, the most devastating war in history was finally over. But, the end of the fighting was really just the beginning of a whole new chapter. The world that crawled out from the rubble of World War II was a completely different place than the one that had gone into it. Yeah, the old way of doing things was just gone. In its place, you get the United Nations, created with the hope of preventing another war like this. The US and the Soviet Union come out as the two new global superpowers, which, of course, kicks off the Cold War. And all over the world, old colonial empires start to fall apart as people fight for their independence. When you boil it all down, the war is just this horrific reminder of what happens when nationalism and hate are left unchecked. The big lesson, really, is how incredibly important it is for countries to work together and to have a shared respect for basic human rights and dignity. The world we live in today was forged in the fires of that conflict, from our international institutions to our global politics, which kind of leaves us with one last question to think about. Are we still actually paying attention to those incredibly hard-won lessons? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining us.